You might not have heard the term Xennial until recently, and yet the moment you see it, something clicks, like a memory surfacing without even knowing you had one. You read it and think, that's me, that's exactly me. That's because Xennials occupy a psychological space that feels intensely personal and uniquely recognizable, even if our culture didn't give it a name until relatively recently. To understand the psychology of Xennials is to understand a generation caught between worlds, between analog and digital, between the certainties of the 20th century and the disruptions of the 21st. It's a fascinating story of identity, adaptation, and the shaping of self in a world in flux. From the moment you were born, sometime between the late 1970s and early 1980s, you arrived at a particular inflection point in human history. Not quite Generation X, not quite a millennial, you are something distinct, shaped by rapid change, but rooted in the foundations that came before the digital age took over. The psychological imprint of this transitional space has profound implications for how you think, how you relate, how you cope, and how you thrive. At the heart of the Xennial psyche is a lived experience of two worlds. You remember a time without smartphones. Dial-up tones weren't noise pollution, they were the official sound of connection itself. You grew up in an environment where books were physical, music was on tapes or CDs, and the internet was something you connected to rather than something that perpetually connected you. And yet, by the time adulthood arrived, this digital revolution wasn't just knocking, it had already broken down the door. There's a psychological depth in living through that transition. When you think about your youth, you don't see it as purely nostalgic, you see it as formative in a way that equipped you with something almost paradoxical. Digital adaptability anchored by analog resilience. You didn't grow up in the digital age, but you matured with it. This gives you a form of mental flexibility that is rarely talked about, but deeply real. Consider how this shapes your identity. Most generations anchor their self-perceptions in a shared cultural narrative. Boomers grew up in the shadow of post-war optimism and social revolutions. Generation X saw the dissolution of rigid social structures and came to value independence and skepticism. Millennials faced economic uncertainty and the promise of a hyper-connected world. But Xennials carry elements of all of these experiences, and none fully at the same time. So you constantly negotiate this psychological perimeter between worlds. You grew up playing outside, yet you embraced early online communities. You used payphones and landlines, yet you adapted to texting and social media. You remember paper maps, yet you now rely, with not a small degree of awe, on GPS that talks back. Because of this duality, your psychological landscape is shaped by a unique tension, a comfort with ambiguity. You learn to cope, not because you were thrust into a stable environment where everything made sense, but because you witnessed order dissolve and reconfigure around you. The adolescent world you knew was coherent. The adult world you entered was fragmented and accelerating at a pace no previous generation had known, and you learned to adapt. This psychological adaptability is not just cognitive, it's emotional. You can hold memories of playing backyard games until dusk alongside memories of your first AIM chat. You can feel deeply nostalgic for physical mixtapes, but also understand the emotional power of curated playlists. There's a certain emotional agility inherent in this positioning, a capacity to be both here and there, to carry multiple versions of reality without feeling completely at home in either. That emotional agility has another face, a profound sensitivity to change. Unlike generations raised fully digital, you remember what it was like before. That absence has become a form of emotional reference. And unlike generations that never knew a world without screens, you feel the shift vividly. The introduction of each new platform, each new device, each innovation in how we communicate and relate has a psychological imprint that resonates more deeply for you. You don't just learn new tools, you witness the transformation of social reality. And that can be thrilling, exhilarating even, but it can also be unsettling.
To be a Xennial psychologically means carrying a kind of existential awareness about time and meaning. You experienced adolescence before the omnipresence of surveillance-like social media, so your sense of self developed with a degree of privacy most currently coming-of-age youth simply won't know. Who you were as a teenager wasn't perfectly documented, tagged, analyzed, and archived in a public database that lasts forever. Your sense of self could be, for a time, fluid, undiscovered, unexposed. That shapes identity in a way digital native generations can't fully experience. But then adulthood hit, and the documentation didn't stop. Suddenly, the world wasn't just witness to your life, it had access to every corner of your existence. Picture that psychological shift, moving from self as private experience to self as public artifact. For many Xennials, this created an internal conversation between the private you and the digital you. And that internal conversation between what you choose to share and what you choose to avoid has major psychological implications. You developed psychological boundaries for yourself because you had to. You didn't grow up with constant digital exposure, so you didn't automatically surrender your personal narrative to a public platform. You learned to broadcast selectively. And even now, when platforms often compel oversharing, you remain a curator of your own identity, not just a contributor. This interplay between exposure and privacy influences your relationships as well. You learned to form connections both in physically embodied social spaces and in digital communities. You understand the power of a handwritten note and the impact of an emoji. You can read body language and code syntax with surprising fluency. Your emotional literacy includes both analog and digital cues. That's a psychological strength, rarely recognized, but deeply operative in your everyday life. Another crucial psychological aspect of being a Xennial is your approach to uncertainty. You were raised during a time when the future felt orderly and predictable, until, suddenly, it didn't. The world you entered as an adult was more complex, less linear, and more chaotic than the one you grew up in. Economically, socially, and technologically, the rules were rewriting themselves faster than ever before. And through all this, you learned to navigate the unknown. You didn't merely adapt, you learned to anticipate change, sometimes before you even knew how to name it.
This gives rise to a form of practical optimism. You don't ignore uncertainty, you've lived through it. Rather, you've become comfortable operating in its presence. You see possibilities where others see threats. You understand that disruption isn't just loss, it's potential. But you also carry the scars of disruption. Economic recessions, shifting career landscapes, the gradual erosion of many social certainties. Your optimism is not naive, it is grounded in experience. In psychological terms, that translates into what many researchers call resilience. But your resilience isn't merely about bouncing back, it's about integrating change into self-story. The changes you've lived through weren't external events happening to you, they were experiences that became part of who you are. That distinction matters deeply. It fosters a sense of agency, a sense that you're not just reacting to life, you're participating in its unfolding. This psychological agency also surfaces in how you relate to work, purpose, and meaning. For many Xennials, a career wasn't a single linear path. It was a landscape of pivots, experiments, and learning curves. You didn't expect lifetime employment at one company. You anticipated evolution. And that anticipation didn't come from a cultural narrative, it came from lived experience. You watched industries rise and fall. You saw old career rules become outdated, and you learned to craft your own professional meaning from within a world of shifting expectations. This speaks to the psychology of self-authorship, the ability to create your own identity narrative instead of inheriting it from tradition, culture, or social prescription. That's a psychological gift. You don't define success by someone else's metrics. You define it by your own evolving set of values. Of course, that can also be disorienting, especially in moments when society still clings to older definitions of accomplishment. But psychologically, this self-authored identity grants a freedom that is often unacknowledged. In relationships, this self-authorship shows up as well. You relate with emotional depth, not because it's trendy, but because you've had to navigate both embodied and digital connections. You understand that communication is more than text messages, and that intimacy isn't just emotional expression, it's shared presence. You're comfortable with depth, but you're also wary of surfaces, of shallow representations of self that digital platforms sometimes encourage. So you seek authentic connection, not performance, not broadcasting, but genuine, reciprocal engagement. That desire for authenticity reflects a deep psychological need, not for perfection, but for truth.
Another psychological dimension of being a Xennial lies in your relationship to time. You carry what might be called a temporal duality. On the one hand, you experienced a time before instant gratification became the norm, waiting for dial-up to connect, waiting for downloads, waiting for responses. On the other hand, you live in a world where time compresses endlessly, where information, communication, and entertainment are instant. That duality fosters both patience and impatience. You can savor slow moments in a way digital natives might find foreign, yet you also recognize the pull of immediacy because you've watched it reshape social life. This gives rise to a psychological rhythm that is uniquely yours, a rhythm that oscillates between presence and acceleration. You remember the value of being present because you lived a life where presence wasn't always mediated by screens. At the same time, you didn't just survive the acceleration of digital life, you harnessed it. You learned to balance being in the moment with being connected to the future. And that balance is a psychological asset in a world that often praises speed over depth. There's also the psychology of nostalgia, which in your case is complex rather than sentimental. For many Xennials, nostalgia isn't just about looking back with fondness, it's about making sense of continuity in a life where continuity isn't guaranteed. You aren't stuck in the past, but you honor it because it shaped your capacities, your adaptability, your resilience, and your capacity for authentic connection. Nostalgia for you isn't an escape, it's a framework for meaning. All of these psychological facets converge in how you approach uncertainty, purpose, relationships, and self. You aren't captured by generational stereotypes because you transcend them. You didn't grow up entirely in one era or another, you grew through them. That's the essence of the Xennial psyche. You are a bridge, not a relic. You are an integrator, not a bystander. And in that lies your psychological strength. You are someone who can traverse worlds with both competence and curiosity. You are grounded in lived experience, yet open to evolving futures. You carry memories that anchor you and possibilities that propel you forward. You are not defined by a single generational narrative because you forged your own, informed by multiple cultural landscapes.
To understand the psychology of Xennials is not to confine you to a label, but to illuminate the inner dynamics of your lived reality. It's to recognize that your mind is shaped by continuity and change, analog and digital, privacy and exposure, stability and disruption. It's to see that you don't just adapt, you integrate. And that integration is a psychological pattern worth noticing, valuing, and understanding. So when you see the term Xennial and you feel that inexplicable sense of recognition, that's not a coincidence. That's psychology. That's the reflection of a mind shaped by worlds in transition. That's the evidence of a self that evolved not in static cultural categories, but in real time, through lived experience, through change, and through choice. And as you continue to navigate life's complexities, relationships, careers, identity, meaning, remember this: what feels like being between generations is actually a form of psychological strength. You are not here despite the transitions you lived through, you are here because of them. And the human mind you've cultivated, adaptable yet grounded, connected yet reflective, open yet discerning, is not just a product of your time, it's a resource for the future. Because if there's anything the psychology of Xennials reveals, it's this: when the world shifts, those who can carry forward the wisdom of what came before while embracing what comes next are not just survivors, they are architects of new psychological possibilities. That's who you are. That's what it means to be a Xennial.